So we're going to finish up what we did last week, and then we're going to talk a little bit about something from Jesus' time that I hope will help deepen our understanding of things that Jesus says when he's talking to, or why he talks to the people he talks to. And so I thought it was pretty fun. So we ended last week. I think we were talking about James chapter 4. Verses 1 through 4. So why don't you go ahead and turn over there, and we'll finish up a couple thoughts on this. James 4 and verses 1 through 4. We'll just read them again. Verse 1 says, "What is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? Is the source not your pleasures that wage war in your body's parts? You lust, and you do not have, so you commit murder. And you are envious and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask with the wrong motives, so that you may spend what you request on your pleasures. You adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is hostility toward God? Therefore, whoever wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God." And let's have a word of prayer. Lord, we are thankful that we can be here together and gather as saints, as friends, as people that know each other and share common beliefs. And Lord, I hope that we could take things that we hear and that we learn, even among ourselves as we share them, not just here, that each of us would search things out if there are things that pique an interest in our mind, or your spirit piques an interest, so that we can learn more about you, because that's what our goal is. The more we know about you, the better we can manifest you to the world. Amen. So the word there in chapter 4, friendship, I looked this up this week. It's interesting because it's the only time it occurs in the New Testament, the Greek word. And the Greek word is philia instead of filio. So filio, remember, is love, but it's love as in a friendship type of love. Well, philia is related to that word, but philia means a deep commitment. So it means that whatever this friendship that James is talking about, it goes beyond acquaintance or someone that you know. It goes to a point where it's something that you're so committed to that it just consumes your thoughts, and that's what you do, or that's what you talk about. If you take it in the context of verse 1, it's what you're, and verse 2, it's what you're striving for, it's what you're fighting for, and what you're quarreling over. And James says that to have something from the world that has such a hold over you, that it changes your mindset, and it's what you're so consumed with, is hostility towards God. And that word friend there comes from the same word. So if you want that deep commitment, and that's what's consuming you in your life, then you are making yourself an enemy of God. And of course, he asked them if he calls them adulteresses, but I think in overall, he's asking them, is this really what you want to be? Is this who you want to be? And what we're talking about last week, if you remember, was a community. And we talked about how a community should be a place away from the world. And I mentioned, I talked about your body being, if you want to make your body a barrier or a border against the world as part of the kingdom, because the kingdom lives in us, then that's the point where these things should stop. It's one thing to have knowledge of something. It's one thing to understand something that's going on. It's another thing to make it your life's goal or your daily goal to change, to try to change something that's of the world. I guess that didn't come out right. It's not that you don't want to change things that are wrong, but you don't want to be, that doesn't want to be you, who you are. You are in God's kingdom. Who you are should be manifesting God. so I think that's kind of interesting what James says. The one thing about the book of James that you read is he's very pointed about things, right? You might read James and think James doesn't believe in grace, even in this passage here. But I don't think that's what James' point at all is. I think what James is saying, I think James understood what his stepbrother accomplished on the cross by the time he wrote this, probably 50-ish years later or whatever. He understood, but I think he's seeing something in believers, and what he's seeing is causing him some, it's making him upset. This is not what you're supposed to be. You're supposed to be something different. So let's work at that. And so through his book, he brings things up in that vein, and it's very pointed, and you have to take it in that way. In fact, if you read a lot of things that James says, you can parallel much of it with what Paul says, but they say it in a little different context. Some people think that Paul can be rude and obnoxious. I think Paul was very gracious. I think if you read the book of James and compare it to what Paul said, I think you might want to say, well, James is being a little bit obnoxious because he was maybe, we think of Paul as being fiery, which I'm sure he was. But in this instance, I think James was being a little fiery over what he's saying. So the point is that the view of God is what is at stake from us as a community. God makes himself known through many ways. And if we're making him look bad, the only reason we should worry about it is because we're making him look bad. We shouldn't worry about it beyond that point, because God will make sure that he's going to look good because he's God. But it's our job, and it's something that we will be judged for, right? We'll be judged for how we live among the world. Jesus is going to look at us and say, how did you live for me? How did you manifest me and my Father in the world? And so that's why James is trying to get this point home. In Romans 14, we won't turn there, but in verse 1 through 4, it talks about quarreling, not having dissension among the saints and those things. And then if you, that comes after chapters 12 and 13, which the driving theme is love for God, love for people. And then in verse 12, as we saw before, chapter 12 of Romans, as we saw before, Paul gives, I believe, a very nice outline of what our community is supposed to look like when other people look at it. Everything, I believe, that belongs to the world is supposed to be left behind. Now, I'm not talking about you have to go to work, right? We got to make some money because we got to live. We got to eat. You got a place to live. Those are things of basic human necessity. We're talking about things of the world as far as a worldly system that might be in place over us. I can't. I try to escape it, but I can't. I hear about gas prices all the time, right? Turn the radio on and talk about gas prices. That's when I put in a Hillsong CD. I started thinking about it. I'm like, take me back to Paul's day. Paul walked a lot. And those roads that the Romans built, they weren't free. It wasn't like when I hop on 31 and whatever, 590 and all that to get to work, right? Taxes pay for that, but I don't have to pay every time. The other day I went to Buffalo and I forgot my Easy Pass, so I got to wait till I get my bill in the mail. But every time you pass those big things that they make now, you go under and it reads your license plate and it knows you were here. You're going to pay for that. Well, Paul paid for tolls. When he walked on those roads, you had to pay a toll. And the toll was for the maintenance of the road, and because they had centurions and companies of soldiers that patrolled the roads. to make them somewhat safe from thieves and robbers. So if Paul chose, I'm not paying the toll this time, I'm taking the back roads, then he might be giving himself up some safety. And it might take him longer to get there. So he did take Roman roads. And I thought, you know what? I never read in Paul's epistles where he says, these tolls, the prices went up on the tolls again. Can you believe it? No, he paid the toll. Jesus said, if Caesar's coin's on the coin, give it to him, right? He paid for it. So just a little thing. Things are what they are. And that's all set by worldly systems. The only recourse you have to change anything, if you want to, is to go vote. And maybe the people you vote in will change it. Maybe they won't. I don't know. Sometimes we voted people in the past and we thought, oh, they're going to change this, and they didn't. So, it's something to be left behind, left out of our minds. Get rid of it, because what does it do? It makes you mad, makes you angry, it makes you frustrated. And then when you get to work, you go hang out with your friends, what do you talk about? There's no manifestation going on. You're talking about something from a worldly system that makes you angry, and you're trying to change someone else's opinion over that instead of manifesting who God is. Somehow in my mind, I don't think that God is concerned about how much I pay for gas in my tank every day. I just don't think he is. So those are the types of things that we have to get away from. And God forbid we have people in the worldly system who is in charge of it, who are wicked, and we justify them. And this doesn't go to either political party, because they're all of the world, and we justify them as Christians. I think today, Christianity is, in my view, Christianity as a whole, at least the United States, is in a terrible place with this. Because, when you drive down the road and you see a flag in front of a church that says, "Don't tread on me," and then you drive down the road 10 miles later and you see a rainbow flag in front of a church, some people will say, that's great, they have a rainbow flag, they're inviting all people. Well, all churches should be inviting all people. And how do you do that? You rid yourself of worldly positions and you invite all people. That's how you do it. And I think that the Christians in America have let themselves become so divided over political issues because they gravitate towards one or the other. And then they have this hatred for the other side, which is counterproductive. In 1 Corinthians 15, you don't have to turn there again, but it says, bad company corrupts good morals. The word bad there in the Greek is talking about the effects of the evil company. Paul says, he's telling them, don't be deceived. Because if you're around bad company, what's going to happen? It's going to eventually, that's what you're going to take on. That's human nature, right? That's why sometimes I talk about, Father Richard Rohr, who we're going to get some stuff here from later, but he said that the downfall, he believed, of Christianity in the world today happened with Constantine. I've read that from many other people. The reason being is because before Constantine, churches met small, local. They did things together. They supported each other, but they had a common goal, which was to spread the word of Christ. As soon as they became affiliated with a worldly power structure, what I like to think of as the mass of people comes together, all of a sudden their minds all gel as one around this world power, and that becomes more important than manifesting God. As we saw, when the church got a lot of power, what did it start doing? It started wielding the sword to put people under Christianity, which really was to put people under the power of that government. We see all kinds of religions do that in history, not just Christianity. But yeah, even when churches, it gets so big, you just can't, there's no continuity, right? And they just kind of follow along. So you say that's continuity, but there's no continuity in God. It starts to fall away. and many of them have problems. We see that all the time in the news with these big churches and their leaders. It's the power structure that causes the issues. And that is a worldly thing, whether it's religious or political. I think what happens is, these bad things happen, and the Greek word for bad there is perilous, injurious, or it ruins and defiles. We drop off the armor that Paul tells us to put on. It just falls off. And we just kind of blindly go into whatever's happening and it takes over us. And when those things happen, that's when we lose the manifestation. And that's when our community begins to crumble. The community that's supposed to be a community for God becomes to crumble. It becomes a community instead for the world. Much of the response, not only of Christianity, but even of other religions, is to take their writings and say, I'm justifying the worldly system with what's in our religious book, for us, the Bible. And to justify that, the love for things of the world, and justify the sayings and the beliefs of the system using the scriptures is a dangerous thing, because you stand to then start excluding people who don't agree. And those people will either find another church with a different kind of flag hanging in front of it, or they will say, you know what, Christianity is no different. It's no different than what I see every day in the world. They just choose a side and stick there, and I don't agree with that side, and that's what Christians are, and it shuts down. Or it pits Christians against Christians, unfortunately. Just have a Facebook account. Have a Facebook account with all your friends, most of them, as Christians. And you will see posts come up and you'll say, I can't believe that that's up there. Because that's what takes over. Things of the world, things of the worldly systems. So we want to be seen as a community. We don't want to be seen as a community that sides with the world or is part of the world, because we start to shut people out. And Jesus in Matthew 23:13 said, "But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you shut the kingdom of heaven in front of people. For you do not enter it yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in." Now, different context, right? They were stopping people from getting to God because of their religious system. And in fact, they weren't even there, though they thought they were. And I believe Christianity does the same thing today. The same thing. We have the kingdom of God, right? The spiritual kingdom. It's here. It's in us. Jesus said, look, you're not going to be able to see the kingdom. It's not like it's going to be this guy says, oh, look, there's evidence of the kingdom. The only evidence of the kingdom is right here. That's it. You are the evidence of the kingdom. So you got to make it happen, right? That's what we do. One time, I worked with a young man years ago, and at that time, I was heavily into politics, and that's all I talked about with everybody I knew. Politics, 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 politics. And if you know me, I was a third-party person, right? And I thought the party that I believed in was the party of freedom, the party against tyranny, even on the right. And I worked so hard with this kid because he was liberal. And I worked with him for a few years, and he was going to school, and he was going to go in his master's. He was doing political science, and he went and worked in Washington after he graduated for a think tank. Do you know what he went to work for? A conservative think tank. And I remember when I saw him again sometime later, he told me everything I talked to him about, and he started to think about it and see it, right? And I was so proud of myself, right? But now I look back at that and I think there's nothing to be proud of. I spent so much time turning someone's mind from one worldly political system to another. instead of, you know what? Yep. Because at that time, I didn't even think we were in the kingdom yet. I was still waiting for the kingdom that Jesus said, you're not going to be able to see it. That's what I was looking for, right? But I still could have at least talked to him and said, hey, the cross, there's the answer for you. But I didn't. And I think that's unfortunate, but that is what happens. It's what we do. So it is our job to make the community a safe place, to shut out the world, to put it aside in our minds. And I believe the only way to do that is to practice it all the time. When I was in the service, in a time where, I didn't really pay much attention to anything church related or godly related, and I picked up the language of a serviceman. And I remember when I got out of the service, and I came home, that language, even though I knew my wife despised it, it just came out because it's what I did, right? The only way for me to get rid of that language was when I was not at home, not to use it anymore. And eventually, people at work now, even a couple of years ago, someone said, I had never hear you swear. And I said, because I just made it a practice to myself never to swear, right? It's important. And it's the same thing with this. The only way to get yourself in tune is to do it all the time. All the time. Like Mr. Scott McKnight says, every day when he gets up, his feet hit the floor, he does the Shema. And so I started following that practice. I don't do it every day when my feet hit the floor, but I try to do it at some point in the morning when I stop with my mind going crazy at work and stuff. Stop. I love you, God, with all my heart, all my soul, and all my mind. And let everything I do today reflect that. That's my prayer. And of course, I ask him for help with it because that's not going to happen. Because 5 minutes later, something happens and I'm on to the next thing. But when you think about it, you have to remind yourself with who you are in order that we might manifest him. So that's where we're going to leave that. Something to think about. Okay? It's not easy, but it's something to think about. Now, what I want to do is talk about something that I'm currently reading a book by Father Richard Rohr, which is really good. It is called Jesus' Plan for a New World. And you'll read that title and you'll think, well, that's his plan for a new world when he comes back. But Mr. Rohr believes that Jesus is coming back still. But in his book, Mr. Rohr's purpose is that new world is right now. It was from the time that Jesus came onto the scene straight through. Whether Jesus is coming back or not, it is our job straight through to make that new world. That's why we are called out, as Paul says, called out. And the book, the subtitle is Sermon on the Mount. So he takes everything from the Sermon on the Mount and shows how Jesus is calling for a new world. I was complaining to my dad the other day that I'm 3/4 of the way through the book and we haven't got the Sermon on the Mount yet. And I think that's in the next chapter because I looked ahead. But this last chapter that he had was really interesting to me. I've read some of this elsewhere, but it's about the social order of Jesus' day. And his contention is you can't read the Sermon on the Mount or parables or anything and get a proper understanding of what Jesus is talking to and what he means unless you know the social order of Jesus' day. Most societies, past, present, and in the future, are class societies. I know in America for a long time we'd like to say we aren't a class of society, but at the same time we would say that, and then we would vote for the politician that said, I'm for the middle class, because you would say, I'm in the middle class. But wait a minute, you're not in a class society. All societies have a social structure. The only difference is in our country and westernized countries, even though there's that social structure, we all go between and talk to people from the different classes and do things, and it doesn't matter. You're in that class because of what you earn or what you make. or those types of things. And it's not really until you get into the upper classes that you start thumbing your nose up at the people that are underneath you. Because most of us, even those, as we would call the lower middle class, which is where I am, if you live in that class, you rely on every single paycheck, right? You might build up a little savings for a while, and then the fridge breaks down, and there goes your savings. Now you're relying on the next few checks to catch back up. That is where the majority of people live today, and many of them live even below that. So when their fridge breaks, they have no fridge. So in Jesus' day, those differences meant you don't talk to those people, you don't hang around those people, you don't go near those people. So his society was no different. In fact, it was no different that there were classes, but it was very different in how each class treated each other and where you knew you were in the pecking order. You need to know how a culture stacks up before you go into it. So it's easy. If I was to go to Europe, I want to know something about the culture because I want to enjoy it and maybe know a little bit so I don't offend anybody. But it's not going to be a huge transition. I was in the Middle East while I was in the military, and we got a booklet about the culture we were going to because it would be super easy to go there and offend people because they have a culture that's deeply ingrained. For instance, men hold hands. It doesn't mean anything in a sexual matter. It's just a friendship thing. Hold hands. When I was there, I had guys that I worked with in the Saudi Air Force that held my hand. And inside I was like, but I'm like, the booklet said, do not break that. Let them break it. Because as soon as you break it, then I'm telling them, I don't want anything to do with you. It's a friendship thing. They're very touchy-feely about things with each other. Very close. And of course, you weren't supposed to talk about Christianity because they were Muslim and they're deeply Muslim. So, it wasn't talked about. I did talk about it once with a couple guys because they brought it up. And so we talked about it for a few minutes until I could see that they were getting a little bit. And I'm like, okay, it's time for the next subject. They're very friendly, very respectful, very gracious people. Outside of what we hear about them through the media, there are some crazies, but overall, they're super inviting. Anyways, it took some knowledge of their social order and structure. Today, at work, where I work, we have Muslim people that shop in our store. Some of the women just have a little head garb, and other than that, they're open. Hi, how are you today? Great. Have you tried or blah, blah, blah? What are you looking for? How can I help you? No problems. Other ones come in and they're completely covered and their husband's with them. I would never talk to that woman. Ever. Because I know in their culture that I talk to him. There's a reason she's covered up. I might disagree with it. I might think it's backward. It doesn't matter. It's respect towards them. That's loving your neighbor, right? Because that's what they believe. And so that's how I would act to them. That's knowing the culture. And so it's also as important that we know the culture in Jesus' day. So I said I went to Buffalo the other day. The place I went to was in an area that you might drive through and be like, oh, I shouldn't be here. But the difference between Buffalo and Rochester is, and Rochester is a unique city. The downtown areas of Rochester being one of the cities of its size that has the highest crime rate of other cities in its size, is that when you cross into these areas, you're crossing into an area that is set in a certain way. But when you go to Buffalo and you drive into an area that has rundown houses and things, it's different. You see rundown houses and then a really nice house with a BMW. And then more rundown houses. And the people walking down the street, it's very mixed, right? But the areas run down. That's how most cities are. So you have the classes that are mixed together. So there isn't a worry when I'm driving through and I have to stop at a stoplight of have my windows up and my doors locked because I'm worried about some kid running up and stealing my car and shooting me. It's a different mindset, and that is a cultural thing. So in Jesus' day, there was the same thing. If you watch The Chosen, the Pharisees are, I forget where they're going in one of the first episodes, and they're hurrying and trying not to get near anybody because they're walking through a section of town that's not that great. And so they don't want anybody to touch them. They don't want anybody to see them. They're scurrying through. When the soldier's standing there with Matthew, the tax collector, in the same area, he's nervous. You could tell he's nervous. He just wants Matthew to hurry up and get what he's got to get done. But then when they get to their own area, they relax and they're, look at me. And they still wore their garb wherever they were. That is the type of culture and the system that was in Romans and Greece and Syria and the Jewish culture. There were 9 levels of society. Now, Mr. Rohr says he didn't get this on his own. He takes this from a book by a man named John Dominic Corson called The Historical Jesus, The Life of a Mediterranean Jewish Peasant, and then another book called Power and Privilege, A Theory of Social Stratification by Gerhard Lenski. I haven't read either of those because they sound boring to me. But he got some cool stuff out of it. There's 9 levels of society or classes in Jesus' day. The first class is the ruler. The ruler has complete control. At that time, it would have been the Roman emperor. Complete control. They had access. This blows my mind. They had access, depending on the status of the ruler, to at least 25% of the gross national product of that country. In Rome, it was close to 50%. So that one guy, everything being produced, food, money, whatever, 50% of it was his to do whatever he wanted with. The other 50% helped to maintain his empire and pay off his bureaucrats. Also, some of these rulers were considered to be deities. So they got all the money, but they also got worship and praise. They had temples built to them, and people worshiped them in certain ways in those temples. The second class is the governing class. In that day, that class consisted of about 1%. They received, that 1% as a group, about 25% of the country's, the kingdom, whatever, the empire's gross national product. So here, the emperor gets 50%. His 1% governing ruling class gets 25. That leaves how much? 25. 25% of the GMP to be spread among, at that time, an empire that covered millions of people. So now you can imagine how the 25% lived, right? So the governing class would have been people like Herod, right? He was a king, but really he was a crony of the emperor. He was in that 1%. He ruled whatever parts of Judea were his. And then there were guys around him that belonged to the emperor that ruled their little areas. But they all bowed to the emperor. The third class is the class that we see Jesus talking about all the time. This is the retainer class. This includes lower class bureaucrats like military leaders, so centurions, mayors of towns. He says even the scribes and the Pharisees, because within the Roman Empire culture was also the Jewish culture. And they had the same type of system. They comprised about 5% of the population. They were very well educated, and they served the ruler and the governing classes, running and controlling the population, fighting the battles, collecting the taxes, collecting the tolls, going out and taking food from you to give it to classes number 2 and class number 1. They controlled all those things. And they soaked up a lot of the rest of the 25% of the GNP. So we'll stop a minute and talk about scribes and Pharisees. Many miracles, according to Father Rohr, and I think he's correct, pretty correct. I think he says all, but I'll say many. Many of the miracles that Jesus did, he did in front of the third class. And there's a reason for that. He did miracles all over the place, according to John, right? So many things you couldn't write a book about. But the miracles that are contained in Gospels, most of them took place in front of the retainer class, class number 3. And you have to wonder why. They hated Jesus so much. Why did they hate them? Because Jesus threatened their class security. I have read by Mr. Rohr and Greg Boyd and others that they didn't kill Jesus for all the reasons we often think, though those reasons entered into it. Most of the reason entered into it, like he just said he was the Son of God. Blasphemy. That was just an excuse. The reason was because he's threatening us. And how was he threatening them, you might ask? A Pharisee is what? Like a preacher? No. A Pharisee is a ruler. They use religion to rule. People could only get to God through the Pharisees because they controlled the temple. They controlled the temple tax. They controlled buying sacrifices because most of the people lived in a class that had nothing. So it was hard. You think, well, they were farmers. They owned livestock. They could just take up their own sheep. Most of them worked for somebody who owned the land and who owned the sheep and the cattle and the oxen. And those people were the retainer class. They owned most of the land, the Pharisees and scribes. That's why Jesus went to the temple and overturned the tables, because they were cheating people over when they were converting their money into temple money, and they were overcharging people for animals to make a sacrifice. And so Jesus overturned the tables because those guys were selling the very animals that those people were taking care of to those people at high prices so that they could line their pockets, so that those people could get to God. So Jesus set out with all his miracles and everything he did to make sure that those people were around so he could show them, you no longer matter as a class. Jesus was trying to break a class. They were worried about their economic place in society. You know, they're even worried about it to the Caesar and to Pilate. Look, you got to kill this guy because he's riling up people against you, right? I mean, Pilate thought, that's not true. You guys are just doing this for yourselves, but I'll go along because you rile up the crowd and I got to have some kind of peace here. That was the primary reason for getting rid of Jesus. They had created, Mr. Rohr says since Leviticus, I think probably it's more true since the second, when they rebuilt the temple, Nehemiah, and then after, between the books, in the books of the Apocrypha you can think of, is when the Pharisee class really started coming along. And they created a whole rule book that stated what class function was. You might look at it and go, it's a rule book of how to act towards God. But really, it's a rule book stating women had to be treated a certain way. Lepers had to be treated a certain way. People at the bottom had to be treated a certain way. The unclean, which was a class. Matthew was part of the retainer class because he collected taxes. But as my dad mentioned before, in The Chosen, everywhere Matthew went, he wore beautiful clothes, even after he was with Jesus, because that's what he had. It's what he knew. He was educated, so he was able to write things down and calculate things for them and help them out in that regard. And so he served a purpose. But I think now, and as Mr. Rohr brings out, when you read Matthew, Matthew included all those stories where Jesus was telling the third class, the retainer class, you don't exist anymore. So Matthew understood, my class is nothing. So what did he do? He got up and he left it. And he just got rid, it was just gone. He left a house, a business where he was taking money and making money and had the protection of a Roman centurion. He left all that behind to go with Jesus because he understood the message. So when he's writing it, to me now, it's extra special because Matthew was part of that. When Paul is writing, it's extra special because Paul was part of that, right? He was part of that class. The next class is, and this is where we'll stop for today, the next class is the merchant class. The merchant class in Jesus' day was very small. Mr. Rohr brings out, he's got a whole section about it, which we're not going to talk about, but he says today, the merchant class is pretty much the ruling class because big corporations control, whether you believe it or not, they control our government because that's where all the money comes from these big corporations. I watched a video once a long time ago when I was really into politics, which I still own. So if anybody wants it, they can have it. But it talked about what taxes are for, because my taxes are not paying for the military, right? A lot of people get up in arms. All this money wasted on the military. They're using my tax dollars to go fight wars. They're actually not. They're using the company I work for taxes to fight the war. Corporate taxes pay for war and military because corporate taxes are huge, right? And so it's the government's best interest to do what these corporations want so that they can keep getting big money. So the merchant class has definitely grown, but in Jesus' day, it was not big. It was less than 5% of the population because most of the people that weren't part of those upper percents were farmers or they took care of livestock. It was an agrarian society. That's what it was like. So the society back then was based on the power structure. Today, the society is based on, we would say it's based on economics. Where do you fall in the economic grid is where you would say you are. Back then, that had nothing to do with where you were. You were powerful because of family or whatever else, and you had money because of that. And it kept going because you took so much and consumed. Back then, so today we might say that economists would say we have a consumerism economy, right? We have all kinds of merchants that make all kinds of things, and we see them and we want them and we buy them, and that keeps it going. If we all stopped buying things, it would all crash around us. So we all buy things. Back then, it was all a base society. We have to eat. So go out and grow things and take care of my livestock so we can all eat. Because if you stop, we'll all starve to death. There were some things like buying purple cloth or, I got to have a wagon, stuff like that. So you might think, well, Jesus was in the merchant class then, but he wasn't. Jesus was in a far lower class than even the merchant class, which is interesting. Today, and I know this just because of work and other things, the agricultural class, even though we drive and we see so much agriculture going on, the agricultural class is actually shrinking, right? Because it's being gobbled up by corporations, and the corporations run it, and it's becoming more technological. They need less people, and on and on and on. And so it's interesting to know. Next week, we'll get down to the last classes, starting with the priestly class, which is pretty interesting, which was number 5. I wish I could finish it today, but we don't have time. So that's the first few classes. Understanding them is still not necessarily going to bring you to complete understanding until you understand the very lowest classes and where Jesus came from. Then you'll understand some of the things that Jesus says, especially in the Sermon on the Mount. To me, it's eye-opening. It's incredible. It gives you a whole new vision of what Jesus' vision was for a world where people could live together in a kingdom of God that starts with the people that are in it actually being in it and living in it and walking in it instead of what the world offers. Amen. Thank you. And we'll see you back in about 15 minutes.